So we're just about to start here. Last session of the day. I want a more casual atmosphere for this, and so great. So one thing that I just want to say before we get started is I'm here with co-presenter. She's been knocked down with the flu, something that's not COVID, I'm not sure, but I'm amazed, and I really appreciate the fact that she's able to join us remotely. So, and funny enough, she's just down the street. She didn't travel here to get here, but she was knocked down by this. But Mary, did you want to start us off?
Yeah, I would love to. Yeah, so I'm so excited for everyone to be in Spokane as an adult. Every time I've had a choice of where to live, I always choose Spokane. It's one of my favorite places to be. So I'm sure everyone has been having a really wonderful time. As Andrew mentioned, I'm so sorry I couldn't be there with you in person today, but I'm really excited to share some knowledge about the multifamily property tax exemption program and how it's implemented throughout the state, and don't want to share my icky germs with you. So I think it was a better idea for me to be co-presenting from home. I serve as a senior planner at the Washington State Department of Commerce. My area of expertise is the multifamily property tax exemption and some special housing types, including transitional housing and permanent supportive housing. And I also work on our transit-oriented development implementation granting program.
And I'm Andrew Bjorn. I'm a senior associate with Berk Consulting, and I'm a project manager for our project with the Department of Commerce on developing materials and a few reports for the department about the multifamily housing tax exemption program. So.
Great. Well, I know a lot of people touch commerce in different ways. Perhaps given this audience, you know most about our work in housing and addressing homelessness throughout the state. We also have programs that deal with funding of infrastructure, business assistance, especially during the COVID pandemic, energy siting and compatibility with military locations. I'm in growth management services, so we work a lot in planning, the siting of community facilities and also the funding for those facilities, crime victim advocacy and public space and public safety, and also different areas of community service. So
we're here to talk about the multi-family housing tax exemption. And overall, there are a few different items that we'll look to address during the session, but part of this is also going to involve a listening session and a Q&A, because I think that there's a lot of information here out in the audience that we definitely want to hear as we're working on this material. But for this session, we'll start off with just talking about what MFTE is and how it impacts developers. We'll also go through and talk about some of the recent changes that have been going on in programs in the state, both at a local level and at the state level with some recent legislation. So, yeah.
As Andrew mentioned, we are going to focus on MFTE today, but we did want to take a moment at the top of the session to talk about really like why we're having this conversation and what the role of MFTE really is in the state of Washington. So you may or may not know that Washington State is 5th in the nation for housing underproduction, while our population is continuing to grow. So we need a lot of tools in our housing toolbox, and we know that the MFTE program is just one of those tools. So different communities across the state are completing planned action ordinances to relieve the pressure on developers to complete SEPA for their projects. They offer things like density bonuses, mandatory and optional inclusionary zoning programs, exemptions for housing projects or other projects that are operated by religious organizations, reductions and waivers in fees for housing projects that focus on affordable housing, new and exciting partnerships with nonprofit housing developers and public housing authorities, and lots of work across the state in permit streamlining to decrease the amount of time that permitting takes, better ways to utilize surplus public property, developing objective design standards that increase the likelihood of approval, reducing parking standards, and the adoption of pre-approved building plans. So we know that MFTE is just one of the tools that are used across the state to incentivize both general housing production and the production of a wider variety of housing types.
So one note is that we will be using a tool called Mentimeter or Mentimeter. I'm not sure exactly how you pronounce it, but just in the interests of getting you all prepared for that, we'll leave this up on the screen for a minute, leave the code up on the screen for a minute, just so that you can log in now. And then when we get to that part of the session, we'll be ready to go.
And this website and the code will also appear when we start the listening session. So if you don't do it right now, you'll see that again as we progress through the slides. All right, I don't want to cut anyone off who's frantically typing. So next, let's get into really what is the MFTE, or the Multifamily Property Tax Exemption Program. So MFTE is an incentive for the creation of multifamily housing. And the enabling legislation is RCW 8414, and it defines multifamily housing as 4 units or more. And the development needs to occur within a designated urban center, which is called a residential targeted area, or an RTA. RTAs have to be in an urban center, and they're defined as compact, identifiable districts with access to products and services from local business establishments, adequate public facilities, and a mixture of uses and activities. It's worth noting here that originally MFTE was adopted in 1995 to help implement the Growth Management Act and its housing goals. So the tax exemption only applies to the assessed value of the improvements related to the residential uses of the property. The MFTE program can be used to apply to new residential construction, conversion, and rehabilitation. And it only applies to properties that would otherwise pay property tax. So let's see if we can make that a little simpler to understand. In this image, which Andrew dropped into this slide, and I think a visual can really help us kind of capture what is MFTE truly doing. And it's exempting just the taxable portion that would be paid on the residential improvement. You can see in this slide image that they would still pay taxes on land and still pay taxes on commercial improvements. So we're just removing the taxes on the residential portion of the property value for a period varying from 8 to 20 years.
And that's very relevant when we're talking about mixed use projects, where if you have ground floor retail, that's not going to be subject to the tax exemption. So typically a portion of the structure value is going to remain taxed.
And then this second image shows a little bit more over a timeline. So in this example, it's affordable rents for 12 years. So the MFTE, or the tax exemption, is running through a period of 12 years. And the affordable rents are set at an affordability level of either 80% of area median income up to 120% of area median income, depending, or they can be used as units that are for sale and have these restrictions on their for sale value or their rent amounts for 12 years, the same time period as the tax exemption.
Now, one other thing to note here is that we're providing kind of the base model for MFTE here, but there are communities that have extended this out to include other types of public goods with the MFTE program. So for example, there are communities that have put in requirements for LEED Silver buildings as part of their MFTE program as one of the additional requirements beyond affordable rents. Same thing where some have provided for additional public amenities as a condition of the contract.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Andrew. That was a good reminder. So to close off what is MFTE, we wanted to show you a map of where MFTE programs have been adopted across the state. So here you can see that 55 communities across the state have adopted MFTE programs. However, it's worth noting here that only 31 of those communities have issued final certificates of tax exemption. So there are communities that have adopted MFTE programs, but have not seen applications for development utilizing MFTE. In part, we think that some of the uptake or the delay is that the program can be a little bit tough to understand or to manage because it has a lot of options. So here you can see on the screen descriptions of the 8-year program, 12-year program, 20-year rental program, and 20-year ownership program. There were recent legislative updates that have changed what cities and counties can adopt MFTE programs across the state. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. But you can see here that as you're choosing where to site different housing projects across the state, you can look and see if they have an MFTE program and whether or not your project will meet the requirements of MFTE. It's worth noting, as Andrew just mentioned, that some local jurisdictions will adopt more kind of localized customizations for MFTE, which could increase the minimum affordability requirements, could change density requirements, have transit requirements, and also the adoption of inclusionary zoning. Developers that are interested in participating in MFTE should always check with local codes and the local staff to request information on what's available and what special requirements may have been locally adopted.
So the question here is, how does this impact developers? MFT is an incentive, and it's intended to leverage mostly private sector activity to generate affordable units, increase housing production, and spur neighborhood revitalization. So the main mechanism for this is essentially decreased operating expenses as a result of that reduction in property taxes. If your property taxes go down by 90% or so over a 8, 12, or 20-year period, that's a considerable incentive in many cases. And this is often used as a means of spurring development that wouldn't otherwise occur within a market. And like I said, this can be promoting affordable housing, but this also can be encouraging the redevelopment of certain neighborhoods or areas that really do need additional housing investment. So one example of that would be, the city of Vancouver has done a lot with revitalizing their waterfront and promoting that through their MFTE program. But with that, MFTE does also come with some obligations. There are, for the 8-year MFTE for cities, there are cases where there may not be a lot of strings attached to the program. It may be an incentive to develop in an area that otherwise would not receive a lot of investment. But for the 12 and the 20-year options, there are clear requirements for rent-restricted, income-restricted units. At minimum, it's 80 to 115% AMI for 20% of the units with the 12-year, and then 80% AMI for 25% of the units for the 20-year. And yeah, okay, great.
I'm nodding. Mhm.
So, but there are other additional things that have been included through recent legislation. We'll go over this in a little bit more detail in a bit, but relocation assistance has been included in the 12-year MFTE program, for example, as a means of managing some issues with housing stability as a program, as a project transitions out of the MFTE program. There are also, I had mentioned this before, the possibility of other public benefits. We'll go into a few more in a minute, but really this involves other things like LEED certification. There are cases where recent amendments have provided some additional requirements for construction, so paying fair wages, for example, in certain situations. So there are, based on the community, there may be some requirements that developers will need to go through to fulfill the requirements of the MFTE program, and that property owners after construction will continue to be obligated to do to maintain that exemption. So.
I think it's worth mentioning here just that income restricted rents can start in year 0, even though the tax exemption won't start until year 1, which is January 1 of the following year. So I know there's a note on the slide here, but good to remember that you may have some revenue issues that are related to having those income restricted rents in year 0. So let's talk about what's changed in 2021 with MFTE. First, as Andrew mentioned, he serves as the project manager from Berk Consulting on some really exciting work that we partner on with myself as the project manager for the Department of Commerce. So here's a picture of me from happier times at Spokane Falls when I did not feel under the weather. So we have published a workbook. The workbook has information to really build an MFTE program from the ground up. It has the challenges and opportunities that we think would be most interesting for developers and stakeholders within communities. And then we have also technical assistance staff, and that's me. I'm based in Spokane and provide technical assistance for the multifamily property tax exemption, but I'm just one member of a larger housing team within growth management services. And we provide technical assistance on a range of housing topics, including utilities, the newly adopted HB 1220, which changes the requirements for the housing element under the Growth Management Act, and also doing some important work with incentivizing middle housing and transit-oriented development. So let's talk just a little bit more about these 2021 changes. As Senate Bill 5287 was adopted and now allows all cities and more counties to develop the 12-year MFTE program. It also now allows for 8-year and 12-year projects to receive a 12-year exemption when they start providing rent-restricted units. Those aren't always required in the 8-year project. Projects must provide tenant relocation services at the end of year 11 and year 12 if that project was approved by a county. And that tenant relocation assistance is the value of 1 month's rent, and it needs to be offered at the end of year 11 and then again at the end of year 12. MFTE projects must evaluate the risk of physical and economic displacements as a result of the program. And again, that's with counties. And reports to Commerce are now due by April 1st of each year. SB 5287 also created the new 20-year exemption, which requires a set aside of 20% of units as permanently affordable when it's a rental program, and a set aside of 25% of units that are permanently affordable for owner-occupied housing. It's important to note for the 20-year owner-occupied housing, there is also a requirement that those 25% of housing units be sold to or managed by a nonprofit partner or government agency that serves as the enforcement for the MFTE program, but also the support for the tenants that are living in those units. SB 5287 also requires Commerce to develop an auditing program, which Andrew and I have been working hard on, but it's difficult and we'll get there. But the workbook was our first project that we were able to release, and it's really provided a lot of resources to communities throughout the state.
So again, the question comes, how does this impact developers? And one thing to note about the history of the program is that way back in '95, I mean, this was really intended as a means for neighborhood and urban center revitalization. And over time, and this is something that came out in a lot of discussions that we had with different cities, over time, it's slowly moved towards being a housing affordability tool. So the changes with 5287 were ones that really pushed the program more towards discussions of housing affordability. And the first thing, the biggest thing by far is that at this point, a broader range of jurisdictions can now have access to the program. Whereas before, Pierce County, for example, was the only county that was able to have an MFTE program, and only in a small area around Pacific Lutheran University. Now there are multiple counties that can have MFTE programs within their urban growth areas. It is limited to counties that have an unincorporated population of 170,000 or more. So this is not necessarily this is not applicable to every county in Washington, but it has expanded it significantly. And as well, it's also been expanded out to smaller cities and towns where you now have smaller towns that often have issues with trying to spur affordable housing development, and they have the ability, this tool in their toolkit to put to use. The 20-year option is also one that's quite exciting because it works to encourage like permanent options for housing affordability. So there is the rental housing option, which I should note is limited because cities had to take action before 2021 to implement it under the current legislation. But that does pose some future prospects if that specific condition were to be changed. But then this option of owner-occupied housing as a permanently affordable option supported through a 20-year MFTE is also pretty exciting. And this is something that I should note as well here, that a lot of these programs are not really applicable to nonprofits, where the nonprofit would be getting a tax exemption in some other way. So a housing authority, for example, or certain nonprofits can't really take advantage of this. However, if you are a housing organization that's looking to promote affordable home ownership, and you can use this as a means of reducing the property taxes that the homeowners will pay over a 20-year period, that's actually a pretty strong option that's available, that can actually improve the ability for these potential homeowners to afford housing. Finally, as I was talking about before briefly, relocation assistance has also been added to the program as part of the 12-year, both the 12-year extension as well as the 12-year MFT program. And this, combined with what Mary was talking about before with kind of the beginning and end of the program not overlapping with lease periods, It does reduce the net incentives of the program, given that a lot of property owners are going to be holding on to affordable leases both before and after the exemption takes place, and will have to also provide 1 month's rent for relocation assistance. But overall, this was an attempt to try to address the issues where MFTs expire and you have a number of different households that are relying on an affordable option that are suddenly in need of moving as their units suddenly become market rate. So another thing to note here is measuring public benefit. Now, from a public policy perspective, it is important to get a better understanding of, how much is the public providing as a subsidy or as an incentive, and what is being received for that. And it may sound like an easy question on the surface. It's simply just the amount that's exempted, and then what the offset and the rent might be. But both of these sides of the equation can be difficult to talk about. And for one, when we're talking about the 8-year MFTE, a lot of the benefits have to do with increases in housing production, both over a broad jurisdiction, but also how it supports revitalization and redevelopment. So within certain areas, MFTE can serve as a catalyst for attracting additional investment within a neighborhood. And that can be difficult to measure because it can be a hard thing to understand when the market would turn for a given neighborhood with or without the MFTE incentive in place. Additionally, there are certainly cases where there are differences between market rent and income restricted rent in MFTE units. But there's also the question of whether property owners are increasing market rate rents within certain projects to offset kind of the loss of rent to income restricted, rent restricted units. And then finally, there are certainly cases as well where there are other public amenities or there are other public benefits that are required through an MFTE contract. And, again, we can talk about just the cost of providing public spaces if cities were to do that themselves, or some monetization of the development of a LEED Silver building, but that can be a little bit harder to quantify. So we're certainly working to provide a better perspective on what these public benefits are as part of the work that we're doing with the Department of Commerce. But it's not simply a matter of just adding up a tax exemption for 12 years and calling it a day. On top of that, the public costs can also be difficult to assess and present. And this is also a case where a number of different communities are experiencing some pushback with their exemption programs because there is this perception that developers make big profits, that this is just another handout. And in many cases, these exemptions are targeted for very specific reasons. And there may be other indirect benefits that come in through new development within an area with REITs, with sales taxes, with B&O taxes, and other types of activity. But finally, in terms of public costs, the thing that really does complicate the issue is with respect to tax shift. And I could talk for an hour about that. It's a complex concept, but in short, the way that assessors tally new construction value for calculating out levy lids for setting property taxes, they will add the interim construction value of a MFTE project before it receives the exemption. What this essentially means is that there is a risk in certain jurisdictions where the tax obligation of an MFTE project isn't taken out of foregone revenue from a jurisdiction. It's just shifted over to other property taxpayers. And in this case, this is a bit of a conundrum because this tax shift can defray some of the financial impacts to a jurisdiction's revenue. But on the other hand, it can serve as an increase to other property taxes in the jurisdiction. So again, this is a case where accounting for the costs and the benefits can be a difficult thing to do. But next slide. But as we're going through, it really is on both the developers and the jurisdictions to make these costs and benefits clearer. That for developers, ensuring that there's clarity about the number of units that have been developed because of the MFTE program can be very useful in highlighting the benefits of the exemption. It's also important to understand what that implicit subsidy is. What does it cost to provide income restricted rents or to sell at income restricted prices for owner occupied projects? And for developers to provide pro forma examples, financial expertise for jurisdictions that are working to measure these impacts can be essential for highlighting the benefits of this program. With jurisdictions, there are certainly a number of different ways of presenting the net benefits, but I think first and foremost above all of these is just expressing the reasons why this program exists. The fact, determining upfront, is this for increasing housing production? Is this for neighborhood and urban center revitalization? Is this for affordable housing options? So I'll just go to the next slide. We're kind of,
Yeah, great. So I just want to take a moment to talk a little bit about HB 1220, which I mentioned earlier, did make some changes to the Growth Management Act, specifically in requirements for housing. The new Growth Management Act housing goal states that jurisdictions need to plan for and accommodate housing affordable to all economic segments. This is a lot more teeth in the GMA than had been there previously, which previously it just said to encourage the availability of affordable housing. Commerce is working now to provide housing projections at different income brackets to counties across the state. And then those counties will work with the jurisdictions to decide how that will kind of get parsed out in different sort of cities, towns, and unincorporated county areas. And the local housing element also needs to review land capacity and develop the density or the housing policies and options so that they can hit the population as described in these different income brackets. So Commerce is providing those countywide housing need numbers and also some tools to help with that allocation process. We did just release a few new tools and have some items out specifically around racially disparate impacts and also the toolkit for assigning these different income brackets across jurisdictions. And I know sometimes Commerce's website can be a little tough to find. So when you get these slides as a PDF, that link will work to take you to our latest information on how jurisdictions are being encouraged to plan for and accommodate housing affordable to all economic segments. HB 1220 also went on to call out specific housing types. So cities shall not prohibit transitional housing or permanent supportive housing in any zones in which residential dwelling units or hotels are allowed. And that does include zones with single family residential homes. And cities shall also not prohibit indoor emergency shelters and indoor emergency housing in any zones in which hotels are allowed. unless they've adopted a separate ordinance that authorizes indoor emergency shelters and emergency housing in a majority of the zones that are within 1 mile proximity to transit. So this is a big change for jurisdictions who previously were frequently citing these uses within more like industrial centers. Now they will become more integrated into more residential areas of a city. Jurisdictions were supposed to complete this work by September 30th, 2021, but we understand that this is a really large change for jurisdictions. And so what's more likely to happen is that many of these changes will occur as jurisdictions approach the update of their comprehensive plan. I also want to take a moment to mention that HB 1220 does allow jurisdictions to adopt development regulations that are related to protecting public health and safety. And these development regulations can reasonably require certain and specific guidance or spacing, occupancy, and intensity of use requirements. However, these reasonable regulations can't limit the number of these housing unit types, so transitional housing, permanent supportive housing, emergency housing, and emergency shelter, so that they have to have a sufficient number to meet the income brackets that are being decided across the state. So how does this relate to you and the multifamily property tax exemption? Well, you should be aware that these new requirements are in place when you're determining and evaluating the siting of special housing types. As jurisdictions complete their comprehensive plan updates, which are shown in the map on the right hand of this slide, they will be looking for new ways to accommodate housing that's affordable to all income brackets. And you may be the developer that's the expert in this topic, and they may need your help. Production of some special housing types, specifically thinking about permanent supportive housing, could qualify for MFTE if they would have otherwise paid property taxes.
Okay, so as part of the work that we're doing, we're also providing the legislature with recommendations for changes to the MFTE program. Now, with 5287, there were some pretty substantive changes to the way that programs can operate in the state. And one thing that we don't want to do is to propose another complete overhaul. The outcomes of those changes are only just becoming apparent. I think that projects that use I think that there have been a few projects that have just qualified for the 20-year exemption. So we need to see how some of these changes are going to work over time before going in and making pretty substantive changes to what's already in place. That being said, there have been some things we've heard consistently as we've talked with a lot of different folks about the program. And one is really that the ability to customize the MFTE program to meet local needs is very important, and it makes for a very valuable tool where some communities can look to encourage neighborhood revitalization in some areas, affordable housing in others, and Spokane, for example, I was in a presentation this morning where they were talking about how in areas that have been identified as being distressed, they only allow for the 12-year. They only allow for, they allow for the 8 and the 12-year to spur more housing redevelopment, whereas in other areas, it's only the 12-year to encourage affordable housing. So the way that the statute is written right now has certain things that can be changed to make this program even more potentially flexible. The other thing that we've heard is that it's just a beast. It is insane in certain places. There are certain redundancies that are in place that are no longer used. It's a statute that has been in place for 27 years. So it's in need of a refresh in certain places. And there is also this need to balance public and private benefit to ensure that cities have the ability to provide requirements that get sufficient public benefit for the incentives that are being provided. So this has gone through a number of iterations, the potential recommendations that we'll be looking to put forward. And I'm sure that it'll go through a few more before we provide a final report. But there are 5 main points that we want to reinforce here for these recommendations. The first is just consistency with access. There are a lot of cases where there are different requirements between smaller cities, larger cities, and counties, and ensuring that there's more consistency between those groups can be beneficial, because at this point it's quite confusing about what jurisdictions can do what. And in some cases, smaller cities may not have the ability to do what larger cities can do, but they may have the need to do it. Like, for example, smaller cities can't use the 8-year MFTE to spur more housing development and housing production in their communities. So the second is with program streamlining and consistency. So instead of just talking about access, this is just either removing redundancies or encouraging broader application. So one example of this is that counties are required to examine the effects of MFTE programs on displacement, but no other communities are. So smaller and larger cities are not subject to that same requirement. And if that's in place for counties, it should probably be in place for all communities that are looking to develop or update their MFTE program. The third is with managing displacement and stability. So the MFTE program is a great way of leveraging the private sector to develop affordable units through public incentive. However, in some cases, encouraging new development in certain areas can also encourage physical and economic displacement, especially if we're looking at an 8-year MFTE program that doesn't have any affordability requirements. In addition, there are some considerations about how MFTE units are designated, about whether households that have modest increases in their income over time and become ineligible may be removed from the program, even if that would promote housing instability with those households. Those are important things that we're looking to examine with this. The fourth point is with compliance and oversight, where through 5287, there's been a concerted effort to focus more on auditing and ensuring that the program is getting the results that are intended. And there are a few places where expanding out funding for auditing, for example, to support cities and the Department of Commerce to develop out auditing programs is important. Providing more flexibility with providing penalties in cases where there are, in cases where people are out of compliance, that can also be an important consideration here that can help with enforcement of the program. And then finally, with tax impact. So tax shifting, again, a big topic, very important, something that we want to include. The other part is that the way that the statute is written, cities can cancel out taxes collected by the cemetery district, parks districts, fire districts. And in some cases, especially if tax shifting is not in play, that can have a significant impact on those jurisdictions, especially if there are no other sources of revenue that they might see indirect increases as a result of more development. So.
All right. Listening session time.
Yeah.
Okay, there's that website again, and that handy, both the QR code, but also this code that you enter in to your screen when you get into Menti there. And I'm gonna switch over my display to the Menti display, but you'll still see the website and this code appear at the top of that screen. So if you're still frantically typing, don't worry, I haven't deserted you.
Not a lot of developers in the room. So just to note, let's see, apparently there are 2 people in the room that have approached a jurisdiction to request that they adopt or amend an MFTE program. So Mary, should we put people on the spot?
I mean, I love that as much as the next person does. I'm actually surprised by this number. So maybe, yeah, maybe let's hear from some folks.
If one of the 2 people that had said yes would like to raise their hand and contribute, it's okay. No shame if you don't want to raise your hand, but if you'd want to contribute and provide us some information about what you had done.
Yeah, or what the outcome was.
Yeah, I just as an individual had approached the city council when they were evaluating or reviewing changes to the program. There was a large neighborhood here in Spokane. They were removing the MFTE because it was a historic district, and they felt that it placed undue redevelopment pressure that would affect the overall character of the neighborhood. So they didn't listen to me. But anyways, but that was an outcome.
Yeah,
and it was too bad because they had placed it there because it was they were developing a high capacity transit line through the neighborhood, which is what you're supposed to be trying to encourage, is that. So it was kind of a disconnect there, I thought. But
has there been any recent developments in the area then?
Since that, no.
Anyone else? Okay. Like I said, no obligation to raise your hand, but so Mary, do you want to go on to the next question? So I think, again, a lot of these questions are based on the idea that there are a lot of developers in the room. If this is more of just getting to know the MFTE program, if there's anything that you would want to contribute on this slide as well, please go ahead. But what we're asking here is, what are the most important factors that you consider when deciding whether or not to participate in MFTE? Yes. Okay.
So I'm Tina Velocity with LISC Puget Sound, and I'm not a developer, but we have a cohort where we're doing capacity building for Black and brown real estate developers who want to do affordable housing. Okay. And they are all emerging developers, and none of them would be able to compete for LIHTC. So almost all of them are using MFTE as the only tool to achieve affordability in their developments. So I did also ask a question in the app, but just I'm curious about if you've done any analysis on the demographics of folks who are using MFTE. For us, it's really been an important way for kind of building this next cohort of Black and brown developers and helping them to dip a toe into affordable housing.
I should know, I think your question just buzzed on my wrist right now. So We haven't taken a look at that, but that is a really interesting idea because, and I'll refer to some of the other comments that are coming up here in a minute, but MFTE in a lot of jurisdictions is pretty straightforward. Typically there's a clear application. There's a set of requirements that you need to fulfill. And that's unlike LIHTC, for example, where it's competitive. There are certain jurisdictions that are looking to make MFTE more limited per year in terms of the exemptions that they provide. But for most communities, if you apply and you fulfill the requirements, you get it, which is a real benefit. So Mary, did you want to talk about the other comments that are coming up or that comment?
Yeah, I appreciate this. The comment that says like location, are we going to build there anyway? I kind of have heard from other developers, you know, that MFTE may decide some of their siting, but this is basically like if we were going to do it anyway, then I guess we could participate in MFTE. Who the market is for the housing, which is something that we've heard before. We did have some stakeholder meetings with for-profit and nonprofit developers. I also like this comment about like, this isn't really like a factor, but in outreach to developers, we found that developers generally use the 8-year for larger projects and the 12-year for smaller projects. We have seen a statewide trend with an uptick in use of the 8-year and a downward trend in use of the 12-year. So that's lining up with statewide examples too. And
the comment that just popped up about no developers using the 12-year option versus the 8-year option, that's also an important thing to note, where communities that have both 8 years without any obligation and then 12 years with an affordable housing obligation, the net effect of that is that you need to provide affordable units for 12 years in exchange for a tax exemption in years 9 through 12. So for many developers, that's not really that much of a deal. Regardless of whether you're holding on to the property for the long term or whether you're selling it one way or another, it doesn't balance out. And the question that came up about what happens after MFT expires, that's an interesting question because before 5287, once a 12-year MFT expires, it was done. And now there are options of extending that out in exchange for more affordable units. The affordability requirements may be different. Mike, are you going to correct me on that, or?
To clarify that there's nothing in the statute that says that you can't require the units to stay affordable for the life of the use. There's nothing that says a 12-year exemption has to align with 12 years of affordability.
Yes, yeah, and that's one thing to note, in that there's a clause in 8414, the enabling statute, that gives cities a pretty wide latitude about how they what requirements they can place on developers.
There's also, I wanted to add that there's no reason you can't require affordability in exchange for an 8-year exemption.
Yeah, and there are some communities like Bothell, for example, that does have kind of lighter affordability requirements for the 8-year, which Mike created. So it's or helped to create, I should say. So, yeah, I mean, I think that it is important to note that there is some flexibility that's included in there. Typically, with most communities, there aren't those requirements, but there's no reason why there can't be. There is What I will say as well, though, is that if you are going to include it in there, it would have to be on title, because another thing that can happen is that owners can look to cancel the exemption after a certain period. Rural communities not eligible. I don't know if the restriction would change in the future. As it stands with counties, it's larger counties, and it's only in specific areas in larger counties. Frankly, I don't see a problem with it. I think that there have been some changes in the statute as well that provide more flexibility for a multifamily development. So it doesn't need to be a fourplex. It can be townhomes or a combination of duplexes, the way that the statute is written now. But and
Right.
I did see one more question back there, but it's okay if we need a. Okay, so I think that we have time for going to one more.
Yeah, and I'm interested to see the answers to this one. So I hope that we at least got to this point in these slides. So what's the biggest challenge you faced while using MFTE? And we didn't write the enabling legislation of 8414. So if you want to say that 8414 is the hardest thing about using MFTE, we'll understand.
See people typing away. Ah, both of those comments are great. All three are great. These are all great. I really like them. I was going to tackle one, but Mary, do you want to have the first go?
When we were writing the MFTE workbook, we stopped calling it affordable housing and started calling it income restricted housing or rent restricted housing, because we have heard from more communities across the state that just general community members are really frustrated because this housing is still not necessarily affordable, just affordable to a certain income bracket. So we've heard that comment a lot. So I really appreciate, really appreciate that.
Something else with respect to staffing. This is also a pretty big consideration in certain cases, because the MFT program is not simply just, it requires a fair amount of staff time. There's time associated with reviewing and revising the applications, developing out the contract, passing it through council, providing a review once the project is complete, and then yearly reporting. And some of that is borne by the property owners, where the property owners are responsible for income recertification. But on the other hand, someone from the jurisdiction needs to receive the reports and provide information to Commerce on a yearly basis. And in going forward, at least 20%, about 20% of the MFT projects in a jurisdiction will need to be reviewed every year more in depth through an auditing process. So, and yeah, and in some cases, there are a lot that are related where getting it to pencil so that developers will bite is also a challenge. A lot of the jurisdictions that have found the most success with MFTE are larger ones like Seattle, Tacoma, Renton, Spokane. But there are certain options. There are cases where projects are getting built in smaller communities. So, and then one other thing, and then I'll pass it back over to you, Mary. Affordable rents indexed to AMI. So this is a weird little problem where because AMI is calculated on the basis of the American Community Survey data for median family income. And it's a weird measure, but it's probably the best measure that we can get. But the key element of this is that it's inflated from, you know, previous years based on the consumer price index, which means that in cases where we're at right now in higher inflationary periods, AMI can increase significantly. In some of the material that we receive from HUD, for example, about income limits, some of those income limits are controlled for significant increases over time, but just looking at area median income in and of itself is not. So that can be a pretty big consideration. So, Mary?
Well, I know we're towards the end of our time.
Oh, yes.
I do want to acknowledge, you know, we want to be timely in letting people out of the session because we're the last session of the day. We have heard comments about property management staff and things like that. We do have some examples of resources on an MFTE website that Commerce has up, and I am available almost any time to help provide technical assistance. So hopefully with some new resources, we can help demystify MFTE. And, you know, I know speaking for myself, I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to share about the work that we're doing and appreciate everyone coming to the session.
Thank you.